This story begins in the middle of the night in 1918. A royal family was awakened and told to prepare for departure. They believed they were being taken to safety. Instead, they were walking toward the end of a 300-year empire. This is the story of the Romanov dynasty and how absolute power slowly turned into sudden collapse. Part 1. The Illusion of Eternity. For more than 300 years, the Romanov name was synonymous with permanence. It was spoken with reverence across Europe, etched into treaties, palaces, church domes, and the very geography of the Russian Empire itself. From the frozen Baltic coast to the distant edges of Siberia, the Romanovs ruled not merely as monarchs but as an idea, an unbroken chain of divine authority believed to be sanctioned by God and history alike. By the early 20th century, they presided over one of the largest empires the world had ever known, commanding nearly 1/6 of the Earth's land surface and ruling over more than 100 million subjects. To the outside world, the Romanov dynasty appeared ancient, immovable and eternal. But beneath the gold leaf, the onion domes, and the ceremonial pageantry, the foundations of that empire were already fracturing. The Romanov story began not in grandeur but in chaos. When 16-year-old Michael Romanov was elected Tsar in 1613, Russia was emerging from the time of troubles, a brutal period of famine, foreign invasion, and political collapse that had nearly destroyed the Russian state. Michael's accession was less a triumph than a desperate act of national survival. Yet from that fragile beginning, the Romanovs constructed a system of rule rooted in absolute authority, religious mysticism, and rigid hierarchy. Over generations, they built an empire sustained by serfdom, enforced loyalty, and the conviction that the Tsar was not simply a ruler, but God's chosen steward on earth. This belief shaped everything, from architecture to ritual. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, with its endless corridors and imposing facades, was not designed merely as a residence, but as a physical manifestation of imperial dominance. Its sheer scale overwhelmed visitors, reinforcing the psychological distance between ruler and subject. The same symbolism appeared in Orthodox cathedrals commissioned by the Romanovs, where vast interiors and shimmering iconostasis walls conveyed divine order and submission. Power was meant to feel eternal, unquestionable, and sacred, yet permanence came at a cost. By the 19th century, the Romanov Empire was increasingly out of step with the modern world. While Western Europe industrialized, liberalized, and restructured its political systems, Russia remained bound to autocracy. Serfdom was not abolished until 1861, long after it had vanished elsewhere. The state relied heavily on repression to maintain control, using secret police, censorship, and exile as tools of governance. Each reform introduced by a Romanov ruler was carefully limited, designed to preserve autocracy rather than dismantle it. By the time Nicholas II ascended the throne in 1894, the empire he inherited was vast, powerful, and deeply unstable. Nicholas was personally devout, gentle in private life, and sincerely committed to his vision of monarchy. But he was also profoundly unprepared for the forces reshaping the modern world. Educated to obey rather than to lead, Nicholas believed unwaveringly in the divine right of kings, a belief that prevented him from recognizing the urgency of reform. In his mind, compromise was not governance, it was betrayal. The imperial court at Tsarskoye Selo reflected this contradiction. On the surface, it was an intimate family space where Nicholas and his wife Alexandra sought refuge from the burdens of rule. Their children were raised with simplicity unusual for royalty, sleeping on army cots and sharing modest meals. Yet outside the palace gates, Russia seethed with unrest. Industrial workers crowded into urban factories under brutal conditions. Peasants struggled with land shortages and crushing poverty. Intellectuals and revolutionaries debated radical ideas that promised equality, justice, and the end of autocracy. Architecture again mirrored the divide. While the imperial family lived in guarded serenity, cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow expanded rapidly, filled with factories, tenements, and strikes. The physical proximity of immense wealth and profound suffering created a volatile tension. The Romanovs could no longer insulate themselves from the consequences of absolute rule. The turning point came not with a single dramatic event, but with accumulating fractures. Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 shattered the myth of imperial invincibility. Bloody Sunday, when peaceful demonstrators were shot by imperial troops outside the Winter Palace, permanently severed the emotional bond between Tsar and people. Though Nicholas reluctantly granted a constitution and created the Duma, real power remained firmly in his hands. Reform without trust only deepened resentment. At the heart of the imperial family, another vulnerability emerged, one that would quietly undermine the dynasty's credibility. The heir to the throne, Alexei Nikolaevich, suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disease inherited through the European royal bloodlines. His illness was kept secret, but it shaped every decision within the palace. The desperate search for cures drew the imperial family into the orbit of Grigory Rasputin, a mystic whose influence over Empress Alexandra would later become a symbol of corruption and decay in the public imagination. As Europe moved toward war in 1914, Russia stood at a crossroads. The empire still appeared vast, wealthy, and powerful. The Romanovs still wore crowns, commanded armies, and ruled palaces of unimaginable splendor. But beneath the illusion of eternity, the system was collapsing under its own weight. The First World War would expose every weakness, economic, political, and moral, that decades of autocracy had concealed. By the time Russian soldiers marched to the front, singing patriotic hymns and carrying icons blessed by the church, the Romanov dynasty had already begun its final descent. The night when an empire died was still years away, but its fate had been quietly sealed long before the first shot was fired. Part 2. The family behind the crown. By the time Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov became Emperor of all the Russias in November 1894, the Romanov dynasty had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, yet never had the crown rested on shoulders so uncertain. Nicholas II was 26 years old, recently married, and profoundly unprepared for the scale of power he inherited. He did not seize the throne with ambition or hunger for command. Instead, it came to him as a burden, accepted with religious resignation rather than political resolve. In his private diary, written shortly after his accession, Nicholas confessed that he did not know how to rule, nor did he feel capable of becoming the Tsar his people expected. Yet in an empire built on absolutism, doubt was a dangerous weakness. Nicholas's reign began under the shadow of tragedy. During celebrations marking his coronation in Moscow in 1896, a massive crowd gathered on the Kodinka field to receive commemorative gifts. Poor planning and misinformation led to panic, and more than 1,000 people were crushed to death. Though Nicholas was not personally responsible, the disaster cast a symbolic stain over his rule from its earliest days. To many Russians, it appeared as an omen, a sign that the bond between ruler and people had already begun to fracture. At the heart of Nicholas's world was his wife, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Born Princess Alex of Hesse, she was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and deeply shaped by the rigid moral and religious traditions of German Protestantism. Alexandra was intelligent, intensely private, and deeply spiritual, but she struggled to adapt to the Russian court. The opulence, gossip, and ritualized politics of St. Petersburg repelled her. She viewed the aristocracy with suspicion and believed that the Romanov family should stand apart from society, not immersed within it. This isolation hardened over time. Alexandra believed absolutely in her husband's divine right to rule and encouraged him to resist political reform, seeing compromise as a moral failing rather than a necessity of governance. While Nicholas doubted himself, Alexandra never doubted the institution of autocracy. Together, they formed a closed world within the palaces of Tsarskoye Selo and the Alexander Palace, a domestic sanctuary deliberately removed from the political reality outside its walls. Their family life, by all personal accounts, was warm and affectionate. Nicholas and Alexandra had 4 daughters: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, followed at last by a long-awaited son, Alexei Nikolaevich, born in 1904. The imperial children were raised with unusual simplicity for royalty. They wore plain clothing, slept on narrow beds, and were taught humility and discipline. Within the family, there was genuine love, but this inward focus came at a terrible cost. The Romanovs were ruling an empire while retreating from its people. Alexei's birth, though celebrated across Russia, soon revealed a devastating truth. The heir suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevented his blood from clotting. Even minor injuries could prove fatal. The condition was inherited through European royal bloodlines, silently passed down from Queen Victoria to several ruling families. For the Romanovs, it was not merely a medical crisis, it was a political time bomb. The stability of the dynasty depended on Alexei's survival, yet his illness had to remain secret to preserve the image of strength. The constant fear of losing their son transformed Alexandra. She became increasingly anxious, withdrawn, and desperate for divine intervention. Traditional medicine offered little help, and it was in this state of vulnerability that Grigory Rasputin entered the Romanov world. A Siberian peasant and self-proclaimed holy man, Rasputin possessed no official title. Yet his presence at court would later symbolize everything the public despised about the final years of Romanov rule. Rasputin's influence stemmed from one undeniable fact. During episodes when Alexei's condition worsened, Rasputin appeared to calm the child, and the bleeding often subsided. Modern historians suggest that his advice, rest, reduced medical interference, and perhaps sheer psychological reassurance, may have unintentionally helped. To Alexandra, however, this was nothing short of a miracle. She became convinced that Rasputin had been sent by God to protect her son, and, by extension, the dynasty itself. As Rasputin's access to the imperial family increased, so did rumors. The aristocracy despised him. Political leaders feared his proximity to the throne. Newspapers whispered of corruption, manipulation, and moral decay. Though many of the most lurid stories were exaggerated or false, perception became reality. In the public imagination, the Romanov court was no longer a symbol of divine order, but of incompetence and scandal. Meanwhile, Nicholas's failures as a ruler mounted. His refusal to grant meaningful constitutional reform alienated reformists and radicals alike. Industrial strikes, student protests, and revolutionary activity spread across the empire. The Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, worked relentlessly to suppress dissent, but repression only deepened resentment. Russia was changing, and the Romanovs were refusing to change with it. The architecture of power remained magnificent, but increasingly hollow. The Winter Palace still dominated St. Petersburg's skyline, yet it had become a symbol not of authority, but of distance. The Alexander Palace, secluded and intimate, reflected the Romanovs' retreat from public life. These buildings, once designed to project strength, now stood as monuments to isolation. By the eve of the First World War, the Romanov dynasty was held together not by confidence or loyalty, but by habit and fear of the unknown. Nicholas believed that surrendering power would bring chaos. Alexandra believed that God would intervene. And the people, long patient, long suffering, were beginning to believe that the empire could not survive without fundamental change. The stage was set. When war came in 1914, it would not unite Russia behind its Tsar. Instead, it would expose every weakness the Romanovs had spent decades ignoring, accelerating the collapse that now seemed inevitable. Part 3: War, Collapse, and the Shattering of Authority. When Russia entered the First World War in August 1914, the Romanov dynasty believed it was stepping into a familiar role. War, in the imperial imagination, had always served as a unifying force, an opportunity to rally the people behind the throne, reinforce loyalty, and reaffirm Russia's status as a great European power. Church bells rang across the empire, icons were carried through city streets, and crowds initially gathered in patriotic fervor. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Romanovs might yet reclaim the devotion that had been slipping from their grasp for decades. But the war that followed would not resemble the conflicts Russia had known before. Industrialized, mechanized, and unforgiving, the First World War exposed every structural weakness of the Russian state. The army was vast in numbers, but disastrously ill-equipped. Soldiers were sent to the front without rifles, instructed to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Ammunition shortages were constant. Railways, already strained, collapsed under the demands of mobilization. Food failed to reach cities. Inflation soared. The war did not unite the empire, it tore it open. Nicholas II made a decision that would prove catastrophic. In 1915, despite lacking military experience, he chose to take personal command of the Russian army. By doing so, he bound the fate of the monarchy directly to the success or failure of the war. Every defeat, every retreat, every casualty now reflected not merely on the state, but on the Tsar himself. From the moment Nicholas left the capital for military headquarters at Mogilev, the monarchy began to bleed authority. In his absence, governance fell largely to Empress Alexandra. This transfer of power occurred quietly, but its consequences were immense. Alexandra, isolated, mistrusted by the aristocracy, and increasingly dependent on spiritual guidance, relied heavily on Grigory Rasputin for advice. Ministerial appointments became erratic. Capable officials were dismissed, replaced by figures perceived as loyal but incompetent. Rumors spread through St. Petersburg that the empire was being governed by a mystic and a foreign-born empress, while the Tsar stood powerless at the front. The capital itself, still officially named Petrograd, became a city of shortages and anger. Bread lines stretched for hours in winter cold. Factories shut down due to lack of fuel. Workers struck not out of ideology at first, but out of hunger. Mothers waited for sons who would never return from the front. The distance between the palaces and the streets felt no longer symbolic, but absolute. Architecture once again told the story of collapse. The Winter Palace remained intact, guarded and lit, while entire districts of Petrograd sank into darkness during fuel shortages. The grandeur that had once inspired awe now provoked resentment. The Romanov image, gold marble ritual, felt obscene against the reality of suffering. By early 1917, the empire was unraveling. In February, spontaneous protests erupted in Petrograd over bread shortages. What began as scattered demonstrations quickly escalated into mass strikes. Soldiers were ordered to suppress the crowds. Many refused. Some joined them. When regiments mutinied, the final pillar of autocracy crumbled. The Romanov state had always depended on obedience. Once that obedience vanished, nothing remained to hold it together. Nicholas II, still at military headquarters, was slow to grasp the scale of the crisis. Telegrams reached him describing unrest, but he underestimated its seriousness, believing order could be restored as it had been before. It could not. The Duma, long marginalized, formed a provisional committee. Power slipped away not through revolutionaries storming palaces, but through the quiet abandonment of the Tsar by those who once served him. On March 2, 1917, aboard an imperial train halted near the town of Pskov, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. He did so calmly, without protest, signing away not only his own authority, but that of his son. After more than 300 years, Romanov rule ended not with execution or conquest, but with a pen stroke. written in exhaustion and resignation. The illusion of eternity dissolved in silence. For the imperial family, abdication marked the beginning of captivity. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were placed under house arrest, first at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. Guards replaced courtiers. Routines were restricted. The family adapted outwardly with discipline and faith, but the psychological shift was immense. They were no longer sovereigns. They were prisoners of a nation redefining itself. The provisional government that replaced the monarchy struggled from its first days. It inherited a collapsing economy, an ongoing war, and a population radicalized by years of deprivation. Authority fractured between competing political visions. While the Romanovs remained confined, their fate became a symbol debated by forces far beyond their control. As 1917 progressed, power continued to drift. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, promised peace, bread, and land, simple slogans that resonated deeply with a war-weary population. In October, they seized control of Petrograd, overthrowing the provisional government. The revolution that followed was swift, decisive, and unforgiving. For the Romanov family, the consequences were immediate. They were moved eastward, deeper into the interior of Russia, away from potential rescue and foreign attention. Their final destination would be the industrial city of Yekaterinburg, a place far removed from the palaces that had once defined their existence. There, in a modest house requisitioned by the new authorities, the last imperial family of Russia would await a fate shaped by fear, ideology, and the irreversible momentum of revolution. The empire was gone. The dynasty was finished. What remained was a family, stripped of power, surrounded by enemies, and standing unknowingly at the edge of history's most infamous night. Part 4. Captivity, Isolation, and the Road to Yekaterinburg. After the fall of the monarchy, the Romanov family entered a phase of existence unlike anything they had known before. One defined not by ceremony or command, but by waiting. Waiting for decisions made elsewhere. Waiting for letters that might never arrive. Waiting for a future that was narrowing by the day. Though the empire they had ruled was gone, the weight of its collapse followed them into captivity, shaping every moment of their final months. At first, their confinement at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo retained a veneer of dignity. The rooms were familiar, the gardens still visible through guarded windows. Nicholas was permitted daily walks under supervision. The children continued lessons. Alexandra, increasingly frail, leaned heavily on faith, reading scripture and writing letters filled with restrained hope. Yet the transformation was unmistakable. Guards replaced servants. Doors were locked. The rhythms of palace life were replaced by schedules imposed from outside. The Romanovs were no longer protected by reverence. They were protected only by uncertainty over what to do with them. Public opinion had hardened. To many Russians, the former Tsar was no longer a distant symbol of divine authority, but a reminder of war, hunger, and humiliation. Newspapers debated his fate openly. Some called for exile, others demanded trial. A growing number demanded retribution. The Romanov name, once sacred, had become politically dangerous. As the provisional government faltered, the family's situation worsened. After the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917, Nicholas and Alexandra were no longer hostages of a wavering liberal regime, but prisoners of a revolutionary state fighting for survival. The Bolsheviks feared that the Romanovs could become a rallying point for counter-revolutionary forces or foreign intervention. Their very existence posed a threat. In August 1917, even before the Bolshevik takeover, the family had been moved to Tobolsk, a remote Siberian town chosen for its isolation. The journey itself was revealing. The imperial train no longer bore insignia. Guards were armed, suspicious, and increasingly hostile. The vast distances that once symbolized the empire's power now served as a barrier between the Romanovs and the outside world. Life in Tobolsk was quieter, but harsher. The former Tsar chopped wood, The daughters sewed and cleaned. Alexei's health deteriorated, limiting movement and increasing the family's anxiety. Communication with Europe was nearly non-existent. Seasons passed slowly. Snow buried the town. Hope narrowed to survival. Architecture again reflected their changing fate. The governor's house in Tobolsk, where they were confined, was functional, austere, and stripped of ornament. Gone were the sweeping halls and symbolic grandeur of imperial residences. These walls were not designed to inspire awe, only containment. The Romanovs adapted outwardly with discipline, but inwardly the sense of abandonment deepened. By spring 1918, the Russian Civil War had erupted. White armies, anti-Bolshevik forces, advanced from multiple directions. Foreign powers watched closely. In this climate of chaos, the Romanovs' presence became a liability the Bolsheviks could no longer afford. Orders were given to move them again, this time to Yekaterinburg, a stronghold of Bolshevik authority in the Ural Mountains. The transfer was brutal. Alexandra and the children were separated from Nicholas and Alexei during parts of the journey. Guards were stricter, less restrained, openly contemptuous. The sense of impending danger was no longer abstract. Alexandra's letters grew darker, filled with prayer and resignation. Nicholas recorded events in his diary with quiet understatement, documenting small details, while the larger reality remained unspoken. Their final destination was a two-story merchant's house requisitioned by local Bolsheviks, officially named the House of Special Purpose. Confirmed later as the Ipatiev house, it stood unremarkable among other buildings, a structure chosen not for symbolism, but for control. Windows were whitewashed, fences were raised, external visibility was eliminated. Inside, space was cramped, movement restricted, and surveillance constant. Here, the Romanovs were completely cut off. No newspapers, no letters, no visitors. Guards rotated frequently, some sympathetic, others cruel. Rules changed without explanation. Even language became a weapon. Conversations were monitored, foreign tongues discouraged. The family passed time reading, praying, and clinging to routine as a form of resistance. Outside the house, the civil war intensified. White forces drew closer to Yekaterinburg. The possibility of rescue, however slim, terrified local Bolshevik authorities. Decisions once deferred were now urgent. In the logic of revolutionary survival, mercy became a risk that could not be taken. The Romanovs, unaware of the precise deliberations taking place beyond their walls, sensed the shift. Night routines tightened. Guards grew more tense. Alexandra's health declined further. Alexei remained fragile. The daughters, once symbols of imperial innocence, now lived under constant watch, stripped of privacy and future alike. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for centuries now existed within a few sealed rooms, guarded by men who believed history demanded their disappearance. The question was no longer whether the Romanovs would return to power. It was whether they would be allowed to survive at all. The night that would answer that question was approaching. Part 5, the night at the Ipatiev house. By July 1918, the Romanov family had been reduced to silence and routine. Inside the Ipatiev house, a building whose very anonymity concealed its purpose. Officially renamed the House of Special Purpose, it was neither palace nor prison by design. Yet it functioned as both, a place where history was meant to pause, unseen, until a decision could no longer be postponed. The whitewashed windows blocked the outside world. The high wooden fence erased the street beyond. Even sound seemed muted within its walls, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Inside, life followed a narrow rhythm. The family rose early, ate sparse meals, and spent long hours reading scripture or quietly conversing. Nicholas continued to keep a diary, recording mundane details. The weather, Alexei's health, the passing of time, without commentary on the larger forces closing in around them. Alexandra, increasingly weak, relied on prayer as both refuge and explanation. The children remained close to one another, bound by shared confinement and an unspoken awareness that their world had irrevocably changed. Outside the Ipatiev house, the Russian Civil War was tightening its grip on the Urals. White army forces, composed of anti-Bolshevik troops and former imperial officers, were advancing toward Yekaterinburg. Their approach transformed the Romanovs from prisoners into liabilities. For the local Bolshevik leadership, the possibility that the former Tsar could be liberated, even symbolically, was intolerable. The Romanovs were no longer individuals. They were political symbols whose survival threatened the fragile authority of the revolutionary state. The decision to eliminate them was shaped less by ideology than by fear and urgency. Orders were transmitted through opaque channels, intentionally vague, yet unmistakable in intent. Responsibility was dispersed, ensuring that no single authority would bear the full moral weight of what was about to occur. History would later debate the extent of Lenin's direct involvement, but on the ground in Yekaterinburg, the conclusion had already been reached. The night of July 16, 1918 unfolded quietly. Guards received instructions late in the evening. Weapons were checked. The city slept unaware that one of the most consequential acts of the 20th century was imminent. Inside the house, the Romanovs prepared for bed as they had on countless nights before. There was no announcement, no warning, no final decree. Shortly after midnight, the family was awakened and told they were to be moved for their own safety due to unrest in the city. They dressed quickly. Alexandra, weak and short of breath, leaned on Nicholas for support. Alexei, unable to walk due to his condition, was carried by his father. The daughters brought pillows, later discovered to contain sewn-in jewels, a last, silent attempt to preserve something of their former world. They were led downstairs to a small, windowless basement room. The space was cramped, its walls bare, its purpose undefined. Chairs were brought for Alexandra and Alexei. The family stood close together. Nicholas asked why there were no chairs for everyone. There was no answer. Moments later, Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, entered with several armed men. He read a brief statement declaring that, due to their enemies' attempts to rescue them, the Romanovs were to be executed. Nicholas had time only to utter a single word, an expression of disbelief, before the order was carried out. What followed was chaotic, brutal, and far from the swift execution often imagined. Gunfire echoed within the enclosed space. Smoke filled the room. Bullets ricocheted off walls. Some of the daughters, protected by the jewels sewn into their clothing, initially survived the first volleys, leading to a prolonged and horrifying struggle. Bayonets were used when ammunition failed. The noise was so intense that engines were run outside to mask the sound. Within minutes, the Romanov dynasty was extinguished. Nicholas II, Alexandra Fyodorovna, their 5 children, and 4 loyal attendants lay dead on the basement floor. There were no last rites, no witnesses beyond the executioners, no public acknowledgement. The act was meant to erase, not commemorate. The bodies were removed under cover of darkness and transported to a remote forest clearing. In an effort to conceal the crime, the remains were stripped, burned with acid, dismembered, and buried in hastily prepared graves. The locations were altered. Evidence was destroyed. Conflicting reports were released to confuse investigators and foreign governments alike. When news eventually reached the outside world, it arrived fragmented and uncertain. Initial announcements spoke only of Nicholas's execution, implying that Alexandra and the children had been moved to safety. This ambiguity fueled decades of rumors, imposters, and false hopes. In the absence of truth, myth flourished. Architecturally, the Ipatiev house was unremarkable, yet it became one of the most symbolically charged sites in modern history. It was not designed to inspire fear or reverence, but it achieved both. In later years, the building would be demolished by Soviet authorities, its destruction an unspoken admission that even revolutions struggle to escape the weight of memory. The night at the Ipatiev house did not merely end a family. It marked the definitive rupture between Russia's imperial past and its revolutionary future. The Romanovs, once crowned as God's chosen rulers, were denied even the dignity of remembrance. Their deaths were meant to be final, unquestioned, and forgotten. History would refuse to comply. Part 6. Discovery, Memory, and the Romanov Legacy. For years after the night at the Ipatiev house, silence was the final weapon used against the Romanovs. The Soviet state understood that power was not only maintained through control of the present, but through control of memory itself. Official accounts were vague, contradictory, and deliberately incomplete. Nicholas II was acknowledged as executed, but the fate of Alexandra and the children was obscured, wrapped in half-truths and denial. In that uncertainty, myths took root, and the Romanovs, declared enemies of the revolution, became ghosts haunting the new Soviet order. Across Europe and North America, rumors flourished. Stories emerged claiming that one or more of the imperial children had survived. Women came forward, most famously Anna Anderson, insisting they were Grand Duchess Anastasia. These claims persisted not because evidence supported them, but because the absence of truth created emotional space for hope. The idea that innocence might have escaped brutality proved irresistible to a world still struggling to comprehend the scale of what had occurred in Yekaterinburg. Within the Soviet Union, the site itself became dangerous. The Ipatiev house, though outwardly ordinary, carried a symbolic weight that clashed with revolutionary identity. It was quietly demolished in 1977, on orders approved by the Communist Party, including future Soviet leader Boris Yeltsin. The destruction was meant to erase the past physically, just as it had been erased from public discourse. Yet the absence of the building only deepened its presence in historical memory. The truth began to emerge decades later, as the Soviet system itself weakened. In the late 1970s, amateur investigators located a burial site near Yekaterinburg, guided by suppressed archival records and eyewitness accounts. For years, the discovery remained unofficial, its confirmation delayed by political caution. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did a full, state-sanctioned investigation become possible. In the 1990s, forensic science succeeded where secrecy had failed. Skeletal remains recovered from shallow graves were subjected to rigorous analysis. Dental records, anthropological examination, and later DNA testing confirmed identities with unprecedented precision. Genetic material from living relatives of the Romanovs, including descendants of Queen Victoria, matched the remains conclusively. Nicholas II's Alexandra and 3 of their daughters were identified beyond reasonable doubt. Later discoveries confirmed the remains of Alexei and Maria, resolving one of the 20th century's most persistent historical mysteries. The confirmation of their deaths did not bring closure. It reopened wounds long sealed by ideology. In 1998, 80 years after their execution, the remains of the Romanov family were laid to rest in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of Russian emperors. The ceremony was solemn, restrained, and deeply symbolic. Church bells rang once more for a dynasty that had been denied mourning for generations. Architecture again played its role in shaping memory. On the site of the Ipatiev house now stands the Church on Blood, built in the early 2000s. Its design deliberately echoes traditional Russian Orthodox forms, domes, mosaics, iconography, transforming a place of violence into one of remembrance. The building does not glorify imperial power. It mourns human loss. It stands as a physical acknowledgement that history cannot be undone, only confronted. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their children as passion bearers, a designation recognizing their suffering rather than their rule. This act remains controversial, reflecting ongoing debates about the Romanovs' legacy. To some, they were victims of ideological cruelty. To others, they were symbols of an oppressive system whose collapse was inevitable. Both interpretations coexist, uncomfortable yet inseparable. The Romanov story endures not because of crowns or palaces, but because it embodies a universal truth about power and isolation. The dynasty fell not in a moment of spectacle, but through gradual disconnection between rulers and people, tradition and reality, faith and responsibility. Their palaces still stand across Russia, preserved as museums, stripped of authority, yet heavy with meaning. These structures no longer command obedience, but they invite reflection. The night an empire died was not only about execution, it was about the end of an idea that absolute power could survive unchanged in a modern world. The Romanovs believed history moved slowly, guided by divine order. The 20th century proved otherwise. It moved violently, impatiently, and without mercy for those who failed to adapt. Today, the Romanov legacy exists in fragments, documents, ruins, graves, and questions that resist simple answers. Their story is neither fairy tale nor morality play. It is a reminder that even dynasties believed eternal can vanish in a single night, leaving behind only echoes and the enduring human need to understand how it happened.